We are now heading into week 14 fantasy football, and some of your fantasy football playoffs are starting this week. The majority of our fantasy football playoffs are starting in week 15, so 1 week away. Either way, we need to be prepared as soon as it happens. We need to prepare ahead of time. So we're making this video on Monday to make sure that we're prepared for the fantasy football playoffs. And a couple of weeks ago, I did a video going through the top 12 defense rankings for the fantasy football playoffs. A lot of things have changed. A lot of defenses have gone down. A lot of defenses have shot up. That's the nature of fantasy football, especially at the defense position. So we need to go through some updates, and that's what we're doing today. We're going through the updated top 12 defense rankings for the fantasy football playoffs, guys. And I am one of the only fantasy football YouTubers who does defense rankings every single week. So please go down there, drop a like on the video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support. Let's go ahead and just dive right into these rankings right now. So the number one defense to me, I remember saying this in my first edition of the playoffs rankings for defenses. I said the 49ers defense is the most fluid defense on this list. I think I had them in the top 6 or 7 in that original rankings. I said the 49ers defense could go up or down. They're playing very well. They made some additions at the time. The 49ers are number one. I love the 49ers defense right now. So their playoff schedule is at Arizona versus Baltimore and then at Washington. So first of all, the 49ers defense is playing lights out. I am filming this after week 13, and they just abused the Philadelphia Eagles, one of the best teams in the NFL. They're probably second behind the 49ers at this point. And the 49ers embarrassed them and ran circles around them on their own home field. Coming out of the bye week, the 49ers have been one of the most real teams in fantasy football. You can see the numbers they're doing on the screen defensively. The 49ers defense is legit. They are a legit defense right now. So Arizona in week 15. So that's the first week in a lot of your playoffs, second week in some. So that's already a very good matchup to start it out with here. 49ers defense going to Arizona. I don't worry about that matchup at all. They beat the Pittsburgh Steelers this weekend. Who cares, right? Like, that's not a scary matchup. Of course, the Baltimore matchup is not great, right? Like, that's not a matchup that you want to see particularly from your fantasy football defense. I would argue the 49ers are matchup proof. Like I said, they just ran circles around possibly the second best team in the NFL. I don't see a lot in their way. And then Washington championship week. Washington's done. Done. They just got crushed by the Dolphins. The 49ers defense, they're healthy, they're hungry, they're mean. The 49ers defense is legit, and they're my favorite player. They're my favorite defense in the fantasy football playoffs. The number 2 defense for me is the Cleveland Browns. And this isn't much of a change from last time. Last time I had the Browns right up here in this area as well. The Browns defense gets a great schedule. And really that's the bottom line, because we started to see some cracks in that defense in week 13 against the Rams. The Browns playoff schedule is pretty sweet. They got the Chicago Bears at home in week 15. Then they got to go to Houston and take on the Texans. Tough matchup. Nobody's disputing that. And then they got to play the New York Jets at home. So that first week against Chicago right there, I know Chicago's coming off one of their wins of the season against the Vikings a week prior to week 13. So the Chicago Bears, like, they have some offensive talent. There's no question about it. Obviously Fields, obviously they've got Cole Kmet, they got DJ Moore. This team can put up some yardage, they can put up some points on some certain weeks. But they turn the ball over quite a bit. Justin Fields is a turnover machine. So I'm not really too concerned about that, because from a fantasy football perspective, the Browns can force some turnovers here. And then the Houston Texans, like I said, it's similar to the 49ers in that sense, except I don't trust the Browns as much against the Texans as I do for the 49ers against Baltimore. And then the Jets in week 17, that's one of the best championship matchups. I mean, you could argue that aside from like Carolina that is the best matchup in the championship round. You could argue that for sure. So the Browns defense, you can see the numbers on the screen. They've been very good. And I think that it continues here in the fantasy football playoffs with the matchups they've got aside from the Houston Texans. Number 3, the Colts defense here. I've been saying for a long time, most of the season at this point, that the Colts defense is for real. The Colts defense in fantasy football is very, very good. Numbers on the screen don't lie. And by the way, this is not calculated week 13 yet. And in week 13, they had another great fantasy football performance, largely off the back of special teams this week. But they still, their defense in fantasy football is excellent because they make things happen. They're playmakers on that side of the ball. So I really like the Colts. And their matchups here, there's a couple of them I like. Versus Pittsburgh in week 15, probably a Mitch Trubisky-led Pittsburgh Steelers. That's cake. I love that right there. At the Atlanta Falcons, who we just saw it again in week 13, this offense is not stable. Arthur Smith consistently is screwing things up. And then the Las Vegas Raiders. So all 3 of those teams have a chance to legitimately be awesome matchups. Now, some of them have a chance to put up points. I'm not going to deny that right here. But the Colts defense, I've seen enough at this point. I have seen enough of this defense. That's the way I feel right now about the Colts defense. The Bills defense is at number 4 here. The Bills defense, I could, if they didn't have such a tough matchup, they've got 2 tough matchups, I think, here. If they didn't, they would be above the Colts. But I like the Colts schedule better. The Bills defense has been better in fantasy football. You can see the numbers on the screen. They're an aggressive defense. They get after your quarterback. They cause havoc in the backfield. They create turnovers. This defense can get after you. They play the Dallas Cowboys in the first week of the playoffs. That's not an ideal matchup by any means. Dallas' offense is rolling right now. Then they got to play the Los Angeles Chargers in Los Angeles, which that could be a boom or bust matchup, to be honest with you. I don't have faith that it's a great matchup. I don't have faith that it's a bad matchup. It depends on which team rolls out of the bed that day. It could be the version that scores 30 points. It could be the version that scores 6 points against the Patriots. We never know what we're going to get. But that championship matchup changes the game. The New England Patriots in week 17. That's a game-changing matchup right there for a fantasy football defense. You just saw what the Chargers defense did to them. Chargers defense isn't that good. The Bills defense, they're a very good defense. I love this. I love the Bills defense in fantasy football. Now, here's where things get interesting. At number 5, I've got the Cowboys defense. Now, before I get into the Cowboys defense, it's very important to note here, guys, defenses and kickers are among the 2 positions in fantasy football for the playoffs that I don't really have a ton of desire to be married to one. I don't really think that I need to go into the fantasy playoffs with just one defense that I'm playing. I will still be playing the waiver wire in most of my leagues when it comes to defense, when it comes to kickers. The Cowboys defense is a great example of this. So first of all, the Cowboys defense, I remember catching flack from a lot of people the first time I did these defense playoff rankings, and I had the Cowboys around this area. And I said, once we go through the schedule, you're going to understand. A lot of people didn't like that. A lot of people were like, you're just a moron. How can I trust you? And it's like, listen, all I'm doing is presenting the facts to you. The Cowboys defense play the Buffalo Bills in Buffalo in week 15. That's not an ideal matchup. I think they can work around that because of the fact that Buffalo does give the ball away a lot. Then they play the Miami Dolphins in Miami, which on paper, that's not a good matchup. I actually think the Miami Dolphins don't match up well against the Cowboys. And then the Detroit Lions, who kind of a wild card at this point. There's no question that all 3 of those matchups have potential to put 30 points on the board against Dallas, but there's also no question to me that they all could turn the ball over and have their fair share of struggles. The bottom line is here, we saw the Cowboys defense give negative points against the Seattle Seahawks in week 13. Cowboys defense may not be as great as we thought. I think they're still great, but they definitely show some cracks. That's undisputable. So Cowboys defense, I like them. It's important to note what they've done, which has been fantastic. But it is also important to note here that the Cowboys have a very tough schedule, and they didn't exactly show well against a good opponent in week 13. I'm just saying, they're not some bulletproof defense here. And that's why they're exactly where they left off. And we'll see how many people get irritated by this particular ranking. I'm actually interested to see this one. The Steelers defense is at number 6 here. And I know the Steelers defense is coming off one of the most embarrassing performances all year. And that's what they do. I've said this for months with the Steelers defense. I've been watching this team for my entire life. My entire life, I've seen the same thing. This defense under Mike Tomlin, this team under Mike Tomlin, they get a couple really good wins. They start getting in their own heads. We're the best. We're on fire right now. We don't need to practice. And then they lose to a terrible team. And they did it at home against the Arizona Cardinals in week 13. It's just how they're coached. They're not a very well coached team. It's just the reality here. This has been a stalwart under the Tomlin era. So, the Steelers are really hard to trust right now after giving up what they gave up to the Arizona Cardinals. I gotta be honest, though, that the Steelers are a very emotionally driven team. And so, when they're fighting for playoffs and, they're gonna be down bad without Kenny Pickett, because Kenny Pickett is not good. Mitch Trubisky is worse than Kenny Pickett. So they're going to be down bad, and they've got some questions right now. Minka Fitzpatrick broke his hand in that week 13 game. TJ Watt went down. So they've got questions here for sure. Their matchups in the playoffs, I think, are largely okay. At Indianapolis, which could go either way. I think Indianapolis could put up points. But then they take on the Cincinnati Bengals in week 16. That's a great matchup. And then they get to the Seattle Seahawks in Seattle. So, honestly, the Steelers are a wild card, and it just perfectly explains what I just said before the Cowboys. I don't want to feel married to either defense here. The Steelers are a great example of that. The Texans defense at 7. I simply just see a lot of promise here with the Texans defense. The Texans defense takes on the Tennessee Titans in Tennessee the first week of the playoffs. Now, I have said all year, and I've said this for years, that divisional matchups are unpredictable in fantasy football. Anything can happen in divisional matchups. I mean, you just saw Tennessee put up 27 points against the Indianapolis Colts. When have they done that this year? Not many times. That's for sure, because their offense just isn't that talented. Most of the time, they're not doing that. Then they play the Cleveland Browns at home. That's a good matchup. Regardless of if it's Joe Flacco or Dorian Thompson-Robinson, that offense just isn't going to put up many points. And then they've got the Tennessee Titans again at home. So they've got potential for 3 straight stud matchups here. The chances that Tennessee puts up a fighting chance in at least one of them, pretty high, I would say. But the Texans defense over the weeks, I'm starting to come back around on them. Aggressive, well coached, fast, young. They're improving in a lot of metrics here. I see the Texans having some good matchups here, and I see them having some decent fantasy performances. The Chiefs defense at number 8. I already know I'm catching some flack for this one. Listen, the Chiefs defense we learned a lot about on Sunday night versus the Packers. Number 1, they're maybe not as good as I once thought. The Chiefs defense also are down bad with injuries. They've lost a lot of starters, and by the way, they were already playing in that game on Sunday night with some backups. And they got more injuries on Sunday night. So the Chiefs defense is not fully healthy. They're not at full strength. And we saw what they can look like. So I was very disheartened by this performance, but look, playoff schedules don't lie. At the New England Patriots first week of the playoffs, absolute cakewalk. That's what you want. Then versus the Las Vegas Raiders at home this time. That's a game changer. That's a game changer at home. Then versus the Cincinnati Bengals without Joe Burrow. Schedule doesn't lie here. And for the majority of the season, you can see what they've done. They've been very good in fantasy football. So I get it. They've screwed some people over these past couple weeks. I am fully on board with the frustration. But schedule does not lie. It just doesn't. That's what we got to acknowledge here with the Chiefs defense. Eagles defense at number 9. And this one probably comes as a surprise too. Eagles defense has not been very good this year. And I predicted it before the season even started. When I came out with my defense rankings video before the season. I said, I don't really trust the Eagles this year. They lost a lot of great defensive players. Their secondary is totally remade. Aside from Darius Slay, who, by the way, really hasn't been that great this year. So, the Eagles defense is actually in the bottom 10 of fantasy football defenses right now. They're not very good. The Eagles defense, their matchups here, I mean, again, matchups don't lie. At the Seattle Seahawks, first week of the playoffs. That's an okay matchup. Could go either way. I doubt they're going to have a great performance then. But then they get the Giants at home and the Arizona Cardinals at home. These matchups, man, the thing is, they're not going to be very widely rostered. This is exactly what I mean when I would say I would play the waivers. Because in my leagues, I actually fully prepare to get the Eagles defense specifically for those last two matchups. The Eagles defense has a very legit chance to be a very good fantasy football defense play in the playoffs. The Jaguars defense at number 10. The Jags defense is a little disappointing when you see the numbers on the screen, but for the most part, they've had some good games this year. And I already had them inside my top 12 for week 13. I'm filming this before week 13 against the Bengals, so we'll see what happens exactly in that game. I think they're going to end up being a good play, but their matchups here, later on in the playoffs, could be awesome. Baltimore is not a good first game. That's their first game. Nobody wants to play the Ravens, against... nobody wants their fantasy defense playing the Ravens. That's just not the reality. Then they go to Tampa Bay. That could be a pretty good game. Baker Mayfield's turning the ball over again, so I don't worry about that one. And then the Carolina Panthers in the championship game. The Jags defense, I think, is going to be a very good defensive play in the playoffs. I got a big crush on the Jaguars. Simply because of that championship matchup, I want in. I want in on the Jags defense. To round it out, the Broncos and the Jets defense at 11 and 12. The Broncos defense playing the Detroit Lions in Detroit, then the New England Patriots, then the Los Angeles Chargers. So the way I look at the Broncos right here is that obviously Detroit is not some great matchup. That's just not the reality here. In Detroit, in their house, I don't like the matchup. But again, the New England Patriots that second week, beautiful matchup I want in on. Then they play the Los Angeles Chargers who, again, it's a go either way matchup. It really is. The problem with Los Angeles Chargers, they don't give the ball away a lot. It's either you have to count on them not scoring points. That's what it comes down to. So I think the Chargers could very well be a good play for the Broncos in Denver. And I just think their defense has looked very good. I mean, the numbers on the screen improve every freaking week. They've got that 70-point stinker that's going to hold them back. But their defense has improved drastically over the past month and a half. Then the Jets, they take on the Dolphins that first week. I get it. Not a good matchup here. Wouldn't start them. Then they take on the Washington Commanders, who just got crushed, and they look worse and worse by the week. And then the Cleveland Browns. Again, great matchup in the fantasy playoffs. Jets defense, I have them over the Ravens defense. Why is that? Well, they play the Jacksonville Jaguars in Jacksonville, then at San Francisco, then the Miami Dolphins. 3 straight brutal matchups here. I'd prefer the Jets defense over them. Then the Dolphins defense, red hot right now. Why are they not here? New York Jets, their first matchup. I get it, great matchup. Then Dallas, then Baltimore. Tough matchups here. Seahawks defense versus Philadelphia, at Tennessee, at Pittsburgh. the Jets defense, to me, they look good. They looked good against the Falcons. That's why they've edged out those other defenses in the top 12 fantasy defenses. So let me know what you think of the rankings in the comments below and what questions you need answered for your fantasy football playoffs here. And if you want to see the top 12 kicker rankings for the fantasy football playoffs, click on this video right here.